Good morning. La Biennale di Venezia is pleased to host you in this Tavola Aperta with Noa Latham and Hans Ulrich Obrist that will be in conversation with us today. And so I think that Noa Latham will start first.
Okay.
We thanks Christine Marcel, our curator, for this great idea of the open table. And we wish you to enjoy your Tavola Aperta.
Well, thank you. I want to start out by thanking Christine for putting on this splendid show and inviting John Latham's works to be represented. Also inviting me, that's a great treat. Let's see if this is yes, this is probably right. And then I'd also like to thank Hans Ulrich and Amira for putting on a wonderful show at the Serpentine Gallery. I haven't yet seen the show, I've just arrived from Canada, but I will still be seeing it after this. And one thing I have seen is the catalogue, which is a wonderful object here that very nicely captures the essence of John, I think. You'll see it's very multifaceted, there are lots of voices in it, but John's voice comes through very, very well. So what I thought I would do today is just introduce you to my perspective on John's practice, which is the theme of the exhibition, and introduce it by way of some personal memories and also say something about the works on exhibit here. So perhaps I'll begin by saying my very first memories. We lived in a little bungalow in Borden in Hampshire, which was about maybe 50 miles out of London. And it was sort of just an old army barracks. And one of the rooms in this house was John's studio. And what I remember about this was that you could hardly get in through the door. It was just a terrible mess of clutter and all his works stashed away and the things he was doing. And at various points in my early life, I tried to sort of see if I could help him clean things up and make life easier for him. But he explained to me gently that he needed a certain amount of chaos for his creativity. And in fact, for him, the word tidy was a pejorative term that was used to describe various kinds of activity and ways of going about things. And you can get quite a good impression of this from the second of the two videos that are being shown here. I was asked to provide two videos as examples. One's right from the early part of his life, and the other is from the very last year in his life. In that, he's talking a little bit about his ideas, but you see him introduce us to his studio, which he calls the Hand. It's one of the rooms of the house that he lives in, which he designated Flat Time House, which we are now running as a small gallery. So that was one of my earliest memories. Then, of course, we used to drive about 15 or 20 miles to see some friends of his. This was Anita Cozen and Clive Gregory, who had a very profound effect on his life. Anita was a psychologist and Clive was an astronomer. And they'd got together to form a comprehensive worldview they called psychophysical cosmology. And John was very interested and influenced by this idea. The Gregory and Cozen had produced a book about their ideas, which they called the O structure. And that is one of the three significant books. I was invited to produce 3 books for the show, and that's certainly one very important one for him. He came to be influenced by their worldview in ways that I might get to later on. But what happened was that at one time they asked him if he would produce a mural for Halloween. And John was really not terribly interested in this idea at first, but it suddenly dawned on him that he could do something interesting with the spray gun that he was using to weatherproof the house. Our bungalow was just wood, and it needed creosote to be applied quite frequently just to keep the rain out. So John suddenly thought that he could use this to use spray paint instead of creosote to create this mural, which was on the ceiling, which also excited him, the idea of putting something on the ceiling. And when he did this mural, he noticed But what came out of the spray gun were spots, marks that looked as if they were evocative of constellations. So he thought this would appeal to Clive as an astronomer. And then he also saw images that looked very much like an eye, which he thought would appeal to Anita as a psychologist. So, but when he presented it to them, he said that what they noticed was structure. It was not these rather more superficial appearances that John thought they would be interested in, but what they saw as the structural features of the universe. So John later on came to see his spray gun idiom as something that could actually represent structure, but it was actually a while before he got around to that. At first, between 1954 and 57, he used the spray gun to produce paintings that evoked certain appearances, like appearances of people, ships, and other objects we could recognize. What he would do is he would spray things, and then he would see appearances in them, and he would try to then, using a rag, sort of smudge these things that he recognized, smudge them further into existence. So that was the first phase of his work. One of the things he particularly liked about the spray gun idiom was it took him away from any form of what he would call as skill. He often used this word skill to indicate a particular kind of skill in creating realistic impressions of appearances. And for him, it was very important to get away from the idea of applying a skill. And he often used to quote to me, talk about Picasso, who was very skilled as a child, wonderfully able to do wonderful realistic depictions, but then tried in the rest of his life to become able to paint like a child. And I think that for John, he was also a very skilled realistic painter. There are these wonderful, he would hate to hear me describe them as wonderful, but pictures of birds, very much in the idiom of Peter Scott. And then also during the war, he was first of all on the King George V, in which he was hired as a lookout, and he was saw the sinking of the Hood and the Bismarck. But later on, then he was given charge of an MTB boat, and you can see in some of these paintings images of the war, explosions in particular. But he actually apparently did a lot of his realistic paintings for people who wanted to have examples. Unfortunately, I don't think any of them survive except for a few photographs. The next phase in John's work, after he'd sort of exhausted these spray paintings, he then took to book reliefs, and you see many on display here in this exhibition. These are on hard surfaces with books, scrap metal, stuck down with plaster. And the other little video that I introduced here of the Pathé News clip from 1960 is a delightful capturing of the way he used to make these works, with cutting the books up, sawing them, burning them, sticking them together with plaster and painting the pages. So you see him doing this, and one interesting thing is that the way that the plaster is applied, the way that he puts things together, it's very functional. He does not attempt at all to clean things up. And so he applies the materials of a decorator, like the plaster of Paris, but he does not try to finish the surfaces up as a decorator would. In fact, one of the principles that he sort of taught me about his way of approaching things is to never cover up the evidence for what went on to get us a thing there. So it's hardly surprising that you see lots of spatters, and it's a very kind of rustically applied media. An early critic of the time said that his works were not well made. And I think by that they really meant that he hadn't cleaned them up. So, another interesting thing about this is just the use of frames, because John never used frames. And that would, in a sense, have been another way of covering up the nails that you needed to bang the canvas against the frames, the wooden frames. So it's not for a long time that he actually uses frames. And it's rather interesting, if you go into this show, you'll see two companion paintings from a slightly later era, the painting out of a book and the painting not out of a book. One of them is framed and the other is not. You can see what you think of that difference. You might also ask yourself why they are so called, out of a book and not out of a book. So, also at the end of the Pathé News clip, you'll see the painted pages of the book are changed. There are just a couple of flashes where you see different colors. Is it working? Okay. How's that? Is it better? I don't hear. Okay, so he liked the idea of the changing colors, and he wanted the Pathé News company to do more of that, to have a larger section of their film showing the changing colors of the pages, but they said they wouldn't do that. So John had the idea then to hire the equipment to make a film himself this way. This for him was also a very exciting way of introducing time as an element into his work, rather than having the visual images in some ways depicting time. So he set to work on producing a film himself, and the first one he made actually was with a small book relief, which is the one that I have hanging on my wall. It's called Noah's, because he gave it to me. And you can see the very first film he made was experimental. He thought that because it was 24 frames a second, he made these by turning the pages and taking a shot frame by frame. He thought it would be too slow, too fast if we saw things changing every frame. So he decided to change the image every 6 frames. And he was interested in producing something with resembling musical time signatures and musical syncopations. When he got the thing back, he said it seemed to him to be too slow, and in his next attempts, he changed it more rapidly. In the film after that, he started to change the frames. Every frame was a new image, and they become very frenetic and exciting. So actually, when we moved to our next house in London, by this time, I was maybe 9 years old, and I asked him, I said I wanted to make a film. And John had made the film such as the one that you saw there. And he decided to try something rather different. So instead of having the camera looking at a work hung on the wall, he placed the camera so that it looked vertically down on a white surface on the floor. And then we got various pieces of paper to cut out and move these cut out bits of paper around on the floor to make another frame by frame film. And so he was teaching me how to do it, and I thought, well, good, I'm just excited to start and film. But he said, no, I couldn't just do that, because it was expensive to film. I had to have an idea. I had to come up with a score, he said, a kind of script. So I went away and I prepared a script, and then I showed it to him. And I had ideas like having 4 images clustered together at the center that would then move slowly to each 4 corner of the screen. And I would, well, what happened, I'll just compete with this other sound here. I will, so I had this idea of having these 4 things move out to the edge and to flash simultaneously. And John looked at my script and he said to me sort of gently, well, symmetry is a bore. So that was sort of stuck in my mind as a sort of aesthetic principle that I went away with. But I came back with a different proposal and it was accepted. We went ahead and filmed. So these are films that Talk Mr. Bard and Speak are the ones like that you can see. And then he went on subsequently to make other films. So he also used time in performances. And you can see there's a nice image of him painted in blue paint, dressed up with his various books strapped to the body. And he did a number of performances like this, which were called Juliet and Romeo, a male and a female actor that would start off clothed in these books and paint, and eventually all the books would be stripped away from them. So there were numerous performances. At this time in the Destruction of the Art Symposium, he also produced a number of what he called scoop towers. These were towers made of books, and they were slowly burnt. And another thing that perhaps another sort of principle, if you like, of artistic principle of his production was never to seek permission for an artistic gesture. So the scoop towers were sort of burnt in front of the law courts. Of course, he did not seek a permit to have this. It would just slowly happen, and eventually the police and the fire brigade would come along and shut it down. He never had any concern for what we would now call health and safety standards. Many of his works now can't be shown in their original form precisely because of these standards. Perhaps related to this is an idea that in his own case, John passed out as a result of covering himself in blue paint. So there wasn't a big concern for personal health either. There was another famous incident when John was driving us to the holiday in Italy, and as we were whipping around these hairpin bends and overtaking cars, the passengers were scared out of their wits, but John consoled us with the comment that the artist has a small margin of error. So that was another principle, if you like, that affected his performance. A next interesting phase in what he did was the artist placement group, and this was an idea that came to him from his wife Barbara Stavini, who was helping some Fluxus artists find materials for their exhibition in London. And when she was sort of going around these factories, she suddenly had this idea that, well, why are we just gathering up the materials from them? Why aren't we actually in there interacting? And John was sort of skeptical of this idea for quite some time, but eventually he and a group of artists decided to get together and form what they called the Artist Placement Group, which was designed to get artists working in industry on what they called an open brief, rather like free scientific researchers. And the artists would engage with the host organization to do these placements. And John himself did a couple, one with the coal board, which resulted in his film Earth, and then also one with the Scottish office, which produced an awful lot of his work. Those are not actually on display here, so I'll just move on a little bit. Around in the 70s, John decided he started to want to formulate his ideas in words, and he's always been very skeptical of the verbal medium, as he calls it. But nonetheless, he thought that it was something he needed to do because the work of the Gregories had not been taken up. So he started to formulate his own ideas, and we see many texts like time-based determination in events, for example. And this was a time when I began to engage with him philosophically, because I had an experience that suddenly changed my life around from being a musician to wanting to explore the nature of the universe, we might say. And I became a philosopher. And I thought at the time that there would be a great engagement. We would be able to help each other. But what actually transpired was that we had very, very different approaches. John was deeply distrustful of any expressions of what he would call verbal logic. And he really took me to be perhaps inclines to be a representative of this camp. So he would not want to address my questions and concerns on my own terms. It would be a little bit more like the Zen master that wants to suddenly pull the rug from beneath my feet so that I have the Satori experience. So we have an interesting kind of history of decades of engaging, but it was sort of like we were never actually speaking on the same language, even though I tried my best to speak to him using his own terminology. So there's a number of instances of our communications. I've written quite a lot recently, actually, about that and my experiences with him. I'll just say one thing about his view of the world, because one thing you get from his video is he says there's an awful lot of phenomena. You can't think of a phenomenon that doesn't have time in it, but he says there's an awful lot that don't have space in it. Now, at the time I thought, well, what could he be thinking of? Is he thinking music doesn't have space in it? But music is quite spatial. I couldn't get around this idea. I thought it was presented as if it was something we should all immediately understand and recognize. But it now occurs to me that no, this is something that represents his view, but not the received view. And so for him, actually, I realized that he saw the world as a time-based structure, and space is derivative from time, and that he actually made an attempt to show how space is derivative from time. But very little of this time-based structure allows spatial derivations. It's as though there's this huge iceberg. The temporal structure and the spatial aspect of it that we all observe is just this tip of the iceberg. And it's the artist taps into the fuller structure through intuition. So I'll just mention also a little bit about the later works in this show, the planets. He produced a series of works that hang from the ceiling, and he told me these were planets, and he called a group of them that appeared in the Listen Gallery for the first time the Cluster of 11. And it is like a kind of solar system. There's Dark Star is the only one that's named. You'll see it in there, the largest of them. And that's the star, and the planets are all part of that solar system. So they've somehow come to be called individually clusters, but please don't describe them as such, because the word cluster was used to describe the cluster of 11 planets. And as he was making them, he pointed out to me that some of them were failed planets. And he was very concerned with the future of our planet. Whether it was going to be a failed planet or not hung in the balance. And he really thought that there were two ways things might go. One is that we become the germ seed of the sun, he said. The other is that we act like a yeast, just seeking our own self-propagation. And he said that future visitors to the planet in billions of years from now might discover us embalmed in our own effluent. And in the Pittsburgh show, there's a wonderful room, which you can actually see online, in which there are these objects that I've only just come to realize. That's us embalmed in our own effluent. So, and there's one other solar system on display in the exhibition there. It's called Four Phases of the Sun. And perhaps you'll be able to see yourself what the four phases are. So I think I'll end there. There's a couple of other very significant books. The two books that I labeled, The Brothers Karamazov and The Finnegan's Wake, were enormously significant in his work. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, try to answer any questions as this comes up. But for now, I'd like to pass you over to Hans Ulrich.
Thank you very much. And I mean, it's such a wonderful introduction. I just, would like to add a few things maybe about the idea of the exhibition, and very happy also that Amira Gad is here, the Serpentines curator, who will then give us more insight also in the show. And of course, it's urgent to hear Christine on John Latham. I'm very curious to hear Christine talk about it. But I think, in a way, before starting, I wanted to also thank, of course, Noa for this great dialogue, which we had. We never really met in person, but we spoke so often over the telephone, preparing this exhibition. Of course, thank Christine so much for our 25-year friendship and the dialogues and the invitation here. And also thank Gemma Reed and Bloomberg Philanthropies for enabling this great encounter here today. I came basically across John Latham for the first time in the basement of Transmission Gallery in Glasgow. I was invited in the very beginning of the 90s. I had just done my first show in the kitchen, a kitchen show which lasted 3 months and was visited by 28 people. And based on that rumor, I was invited to give a lecture tour in the UK by the Henry Moore Sculpture Trust in like 7 or 8 cities. I had never given a lecture in my life before, but they didn't know that. And so then I went to my friends Peter Fischli and David Weiss, and I said, probably, what shall I do? And they had just done this amazing film, The Way Things Go, the chain reaction, and said it's very easy. When you run out of ideas, you just put in the video, and then you go and have a cigarette, and new ideas will come up. So that's what we did. I would always talk like for a little while and then put the video in. And the lecture tour ended in Glasgow, and little by little I had to learn how to do a lecture. And in the basement of this amazing artist transmission, which is still ongoing, I met Douglas Gordon for the first time, and Christine Borland, and many other artists of that generation, of this amazing energy in Glasgow at the beginning of the 90s. And Douglas said there is something you should know, and he talked about time-based art, and talked about the idea of John Latham, explained to me the idea of the art replacement group. It's a long discussion in a bar in Glasgow followed, and we then decided we should go and visit John Latham together. So a few weeks later, it took actually a few years because we needed to kind of find the contact and so on. We found ourselves in Peckham, in the amazing house, which is a flat time house. It's important to say, can be visited today. It is an institution. It's a great laboratory, really, in London for ideas. Many young artists work there. It's a place for those of you who haven't been there and should all visit. So we went there with Douglas, and Douglas looked very, very uncomfortable throughout the conversation, and I didn't really know why, because we were really happy to finally meet John. And it's only at the end of the conversation when we stood up and there was this blood that I realized that there was a piece of glass on the sofa. And obviously, anyway, one doesn't see that in the film, but we recorded the interview, and was an amazing conversation and I'm going to read you here, because we filmed it and then also transcribed it. It's part of the exhibition. And I must also say that Yoko Ono was always saying, John has a nice voice. And whenever I really think about John Latham, I think about his voice. There is something unforgettable, really, about the voice.
That comes from when she lived in our house back in the 60s.
So she lived in your house?
She stayed here for about a couple of weeks.
And in this conversation, Douglas and I sort of tried to understand where the beginnings lie, how John came to this amazing complex practice. And obviously we started to talk about the war. And I'm going to read you here a paragraph, because we published lots of interviews in the book, Conversations. The book is a kind of an anthology, as you mentioned. It includes text by many artists who worked with John. Of course, Richard Hamilton, that was John Latham's favorite text. The text Richard Hamilton wrote, the second text by Richard Hamilton, which is a homage he did in the Serpentine Marathon to John in 2006. Catalog includes lots of essays, but then also Rita Dona, of course, who talks about her memories, and then the interview with Douglas. And Douglas asked John about the war, because he felt that somehow a lot of these ideas, and we talked about the autodestructive art symposium, had a connection to the war. And here is John Latham's answer. I'm going to read you a longer quote. During the war, there were hostilities. I got blown up. The ship hit the mine and it was gone. I was on watch and I was keeping station. This is a very big diversion, but this is a story. Years out of date, before I got to Rome, I was in this boat and sitting on watch as dawn broke. Suddenly there was an enormous explosion, and it seemed as if for 20 minutes water poured down with paraffin. The smell of paraffin was sticking in the air, and I found myself lying on deck by the funnel. There was a funnel on this boat. I got up and said, well, I better call the skipper. The skipper was a very short guy, and he said, what happened now? I was normally very inefficient, you see. And he looked over the bridge and tried to see what had happened. We found we'd lost 3 seamen who had been blown up with the whole front of the ship's bow. We got a tow from another boat, stern first, and we got back into the port. We managed to get everything off it. And so that's when, end of quote, when John was in his early 20s. Douglas then asked him, this seems like it would have a direct effect on what you're doing, a chance event from nothing to real life. And here is John Latham's answer. Yes, I suppose it did. When I was in charge of the boat that had been in the war, as it were, they gave me command of another small minesweeping boat. It also had its stern blown off by another mine. I had a photograph of that as it went down. That was in the Aegean. It was pretty boring. But looking back on it, it was all really interesting. It was on a trip to Rome, an ex-Italian bomber, 3 engines, 1 in the front and 2 at the side. You never see them these days. Anyway, we got through there safely and we were given an audience with Pope Pius XII. We were dragged out in front of the pontiff and given the big hand and given his blessing, and we then went on to see what Mussolini had been up to, and it was his collection, his stolen artworks. I was suddenly aware of 2 paintings on a wall opposite, right by where I had come in, and they were so arresting that I knew they were there before I could see them. They were 2 El Grecos, and that stuck with me as all I needed to know about, that I needed to think about. End of quote. So that was this triggering moment of the epiphany, of John becoming an artist. Last part of the quote, I didn't need Picasso at all. I didn't need Duchamp. Nothing was further from my thoughts. But what those paintings are doing is putting all the work on the front of the canvas. It was like a flat plane in which there was an immense spatial potential, a tremendous design work of oblongs. It was an incredible adaptation of classical painting. And I can remember there was a very beautifully painted portrait of a man next to them. And I thought, well, that's what people call painting. But those are where it's really at. And so this is the beginning. It all started with these paintings. It was actually also fascinating that John told us later that it was particularly the hands in the paintings of El Greco. He could never forget. And in a way, made him become an artist. The exhibition, of course, tries to address the many, parallel realities of John, because I think it's a bit like in quantum physics. I went the other day to see David Deutsch in Oxford, and he talked about the many dimensions in quantum physics. So we wanted to show, of course, it's never possible to show them all, but as many dimensions as possible, of the work of John Latham in this show. And Amira will tell us now a little bit more about the exhibition. I just wanted to say one last thing, which is we then also, of course, the Serpentine show is in a way a bringing together of all these many, many years of dialogue with John. But in between, there were lots of other projects we did together. For example, did an exhibition in Paris at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris called Live Live in 1996, where John Latham did one of his very big glass pieces. So that connects us to the glass on the sofa. A very, very, very big glass sticking out of the wall. And it's so wonderful that David Medalla is here. Yes, great. And of course, David is one of the great protagonists of this Live Live exhibition. He did an amazing exhibition, an amazing room in the same show, alongside also Gustav Metzger. The 3 kind of, key rooms in that show, surrounded by many artist-run spaces. And then, of course, there is this idea of production of reality, because there's not only the exhibition, when one was friends with John, it was not only about doing shows, it was not only about doing exhibitions, but he was always about this idea of wanting to produce reality. So we have really dozens of meetings with the late Robert Hopper of the Henry Moore Sculpture Trust, and the big obsession, and maybe the most recurrent topic really in our conversation were these Scottish projects, which Noa alluded to, which of course are the 5 sisters, and there are many more, but the 5 sisters are a kind of a main focus, and we're showing them in the exhibition. It's a collaboration with Richard Hamilton, photography by Rita Dona, and it shows Latham's placement in the Scottish office, which you mentioned, in the Scottish office where bins of coal waste were declared as a monument, or indeed an anti-monument. So it's very interesting, because it shows us that John's and Barbara's idea, the artist placement group, which they developed with several other artists, is so relevant, because they said, if only every big organization, government, company, business, would have an artist, not only in residence, kind of in permanent residence, would have, if an artist would have an office in these structures, we would have a better world. And this example of the 5 sisters, as John always told me, is a case in point, because he and Barbara decided that John would himself be in the artist placed in the Scottish office, and there were these huge coal waste bins And there were discussions, of course, of the government to remove them at great cost. It would have cost already then millions and millions of pounds. So John explained to the government that this is hugely ineffective and that it would be much, much better to declare these beings in an almost land art kind of way as monuments or anti-monuments of, of a coal age, of an age, he of course felt we should, go beyond. And, the current discussion where all of a sudden the American president then declares a return of coal, which is horrific, of course, shows us that John's ideas continue to be so relevant, and this anti-monument, in a way, to coal, is more important than ever. Now, we felt it's important not only to celebrate this idea of the artist placement group and put in a very central position in the exhibition, the five sisters, and of course also the Nidri woman. The other one is the Nidri woman. And whenever you're in Scotland, you should go and see them, because it is really thanks, to John Latham, to Barbara Stevini, to the artist placement group, that these are, preserved today. And we felt it would be interesting to actually go into the now, to go into, a 21st century reality and reactivate this idea, not just to document them, but to produce reality. And that is why we decided, together with our team, and it was something Jana Peel and Amira and our entire team felt very urgent to do, is to actually create an APG moment in London, during the exhibition. So we have Pedro Reyes, the artist from Mexico City, who many of you know, who is very much interested in this idea of social sculpture and works a lot with government in Mexico. We have Pedro Reyes, and it's actually very beautiful that we have this conversation today, because this afternoon, Pedro Reyes is in Town Hall in London, and there is an artist placement moment of Pedro Reyes with the mayor, Sadiq Khan's office, where he talks to all the different departments of the mayor's office. In a way, there could not be a more beautiful parallel reality. We are here in Venice, this afternoon, celebrating, John Latham, thinking about John Latham. It's not only about celebrating it, it's really about thinking how, it can be a toolbox for now, how we can make it a toolbox. And at the very same hour, Pedro Reyes is in Town Hall, and I now hand over to Amira Gad. And to Christine Marcel.
I just wanted to say a few words about the idea of making John Latham more close to us, and I think you can bring in the conversation maybe some a feeling about his daily life practice, or you, Noa, because you knew him better than us, about the way he was living and having art in his daily practice. How was it for him to be an artist? What was his daily planning, if he had one, or his style of life, and how it was interacting with his practice?
I think already as a way to start, in fact, to be talking about this, it's worth mentioning the context in which we are now speaking about John Latham, this type of round table. There is food going around. There is also this type of engagement and a proximity in terms of engaging with these types of conversations. So I would say that even the format in which we find ourselves today is very Latham-esque. There is a Latham-esque of bringing together different formats, different mediums, in order to tackle a question. And if there is one question that we would want to summarize in terms of what was Latham's career and practice aiming at, one of the things is truly how can we gain a certain understanding of the world, which also, of course, is very fitting to the work that is presented here at the Biennale, but it's also, of course, the starting point for the exhibition at the Serpentine. For Latham, it wasn't only about an artistic practice as such, it was also how to embody the different fields, the different categories, what can we learn, where is the common ground, and how to bring all of this together. And we would see throughout his life, he would combine and mix, return, stop, and then pick things up again. Certain ideas would evolve and change around. So this, in a way, is the embodiment of John Latham. It's the embodiment of his practice of not being fixed to a certain mode of production for knowledge, but how can we forget for a little while what we already know and then try to formulate new ways of gaining a certain understanding, and most importantly, new ways for communicating with each other, which is, again, to bring it back to the table where we are today, is part of this as well. What are the types of questions and how can we communicate with each other? And John Latham would do that throughout his life and through his practice, trying to explore this one way or another. And Noa, I'm sure you would want to step in there.
Noa, if you can tell us more about the man and his way of making art on an everyday basis, or his influences also, because his relation to book is very special, with I think both fascination and a destructive practice.
Well, I'm already mic'd up. I'll just say that he didn't plan things very much. I mean, there would be certain events that he would know that he was working towards and would be out to do, but he left an awful lot to chance and just inspiration. He was very much of the view that there were things out there in the world and he would get signs of when he was onto something. It would be like a rush of energy would be a sign of something. But I would actually like now to, because we don't have so very much time left, I'd like to hear from some of the other people who have had experience with John, who knew him.
We want to hear from you.
Hear from you. Really, the question is the core of this open table is really to know more about who he was and what was his daily world. And the practice of art is not only like what we see on the wall. It's a process. It's also a nourishment from other fields. I mean, he was very interested in cosmology, in
Yes.
knowledge,
Well,
in metaphysics. So what was his, I would say, daily practice in terms of, like, was he reading a lot? Was he walking? Or like Murakami, for example, he says he cannot write a book if he doesn't make like 10 kilometers of running every day. So that's, you know, like this kind of more, I would say more...
the daily practice, well, it did it changed throughout his life, but towards, from about the 70s on, he really was always writing and formulating ideas. And he likes to read, he would often talk about gleaning things from these texts. He didn't have the background to be able to read advanced science, but he had close friends who were scientists, and he would talk with them and get a sense of what the main currents were. He would read certain things, mark them down, and he would often quote them as to be used. Quotes from Wittgenstein and Chomsky were incorporated in the way that he would contrast his views with the various views of others. So I think that that's a key to understanding his later practice, is that it was very much a mix of formulating ideas. As I said, it was sort of, he tries to do it in a way that was not using the verbal medium in its traditional way. So you'll see in his writings that there are these quirky typefaces, interesting ways of using grammar, and he hoped to convey his message in a way which was not using the traditional verbal medium. But that was really the guiding focus of his life, was very much this digesting of the worldviews of others and contrasting his with theirs. He thought that APG was a great vehicle because the artists were in some sense tapping into this time-based worldview that most of us were couldn't see at all. So he was, towards the end of his life, not enormously active in terms of moving around the place, but he certainly was out and about in London and visiting Scotland and Europe an awful lot.
But he actually did a lot travel, you know, in the city. He often, you know, we had a flat at the time at the Elephant and Castle, and he'd often show up there. And before we hand over to David Medalla, because it's so special that David is here, it would be great to have him. I had one last question to Noa, because in the exhibition here we asked different artists, you know, who worked for or with John, to kind of, you know, answer maybe to John, or make a form of homage. And one of these artists is, of course, Lord Provost, who worked for, I think, a year as his assistant in Flatheim House. And following on Christine's question, because we are here in this wonderful new format of these table conversations, lunch conversations, to talk about the sort of, and we talked about, less about food. I never really had a conversation with John about food, but somehow tea seems to have played a role. He would always, have a cup of tea. And Laura Provost has in the exhibition Radiators, where she dries these tea bags. And I thought maybe you could somehow help us to reveal the secret behind these tea bags.
Well, I'll just say that tea was a very important sustaining source of energy for John. And he always used to have the tea on the gas stove. And he would want to keep it warm. But of course, what he would try to do is to keep it warm, but not boil it again. But invariably, the tea would get stewed. So it was always disgusting to drink after a while. Then there was a time when John was having some kind of health problems. And it was determined that he had a powerful addiction to tea. And he tried to come off it and showed these awful withdrawal symptoms. It was agony for him to be without his tea for a while. Later it was tea bags.
And the food thing is, he didn't really seem to bother that much about food, but Douglas told me the other day, I forgot about that in the kitchen there was always a kind of a stew, and then we would just add stuff, and and these would go on for months.
Laura mentions this in her interview, yes. Well, it's true that he thought of this as a part of, the whole person has various aspects to them, and he divided these up into time-based. And the aspect of eating and drinking and these sorts of bodily functions were at the low end of this time-based spectrum. He thought of people as, you could give a spectroscopic analysis of them, breaking them down into the different time bases that predominantly made them up. He coined this term center of gravitas for the sort of average time base for a person. John obviously didn't rate the eating and drinking and bodily functions part terribly highly. His center of gravitas was towards longer time-based events.
Before giving the micro to David Medalla, maybe one of you have some question or some...
We can also take questions from the table or from everybody else who is here.
Can you pass the microphone? There is a microphone here. You have one just in front of you.
Hello.
Yes, thank you very much. I just saw the exhibition here with John's work, and as a lover of books, but as a German too, of course, it's not so easy to come along with these burnt books in his sculptures and reliefs, and so. Could you please answer me how these burnt books are connected with German history? You told me you studied in Düsseldorf at the Academy of Fine Arts when we started, and yes, help me please to come along with this very German political point.
John was not so focused on the idea of the books, the idea of burning as a mark of destruction, but much more to do with the transitions of... he would often think of books as representing received opinion, and he wanted to transform them into something else. So the cutting and the shaping of them is not, to his mind, he was never thinking of them as in any sort of disrespectful way or disfiguring, or it was not a statement against the book. He was a great lover of books. I've often encountered, it's perhaps quite a natural reaction. People come and look at his work, and I've heard people say, oh, he didn't like books at all, did he? Well, then I have to point out, well, this is all about the brothers Karamazov, this is all about Finnegan's Wake. So he was a great admirer of books, but it was definitely, the statement was to reshape. And he was aware, of course, of these connotations that people might have, but he thought that he didn't want to be beholden to everybody's individual sensitivities. He was aware of that, but that would be too constraining as an artist. That's also very prevalent in the case of the God is Great series. So he was very well, of course, aware of his wartime experiences, and it's interesting how he managed to put that sort of in a way behind him when he was debating with Joseph Beuys. There were the two of them that served on opposite sides of the war, but that was not a theme of their discussion.
But he burned the whole Encyclopedia Britannica, and it looks like to find a new form, starting anew.
Yes, starting anew. There's also, I mean, the Encyclopedia Britannica is incorporated as a film in which each page is shot and it goes whistling past very, very fast. It's a way of kind of representing the history of received opinion, if you like.
The conversation, with Douglas, when I asked him about this question with the books, that in a way, a book like James Joyce's books are event structure books. He said they don't look like ordinary writing. They have a circular form. And I think what it has to do with is also that certain linear books got transformed into another form of books. So it's not only necessarily destruction, but as you say, transformation, right? I mean, that's
yes.
at least how he explained it. We had another question, I think? Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for this occasion, and I really confess that for me it's my first time to discover John Latham's work, and I'm very happy to discover it. And so I was wondering, my question is for Hans Ulrich and Christine. How did you, for the first time, encountered John Latham's work, and what is it like? The versions to present this work now, and I thought there's a beautiful title in this occasion, and why did you think to present his work now here?
I mean, I already told you about how I encountered the work. It's actually through an artist telling me about it. Then, of course, the way I then found documentation, because at that time it was quite difficult to find documentation, was I remember that after returning from Glasgow, I visited Nicholas Loxdale at the Lisson Gallery, who worked with actually John Latham for 50 years, and exactly, and there was, every single catalog you can imagine, pamphlets, texts, and so then I started to read. So I kind of encountered the work first through an artist telling me, and then, through the books, and then I must also say what is interesting, because it goes back to Michael Dier's question about Germany. It's very interesting that John Latham was incredibly famous in Germany when I grew up. Because I then would, return and visit my parents at the Lake of Constance, and there was actually in Stuttgart a very big retrospective of all of Latham's work, and he was for a long time also called the Joseph Beuys of England, because of course, the whole idea with the artist placement group, which Barbara Stevini and he very much, were active in Germany, and they were in contact with the ministry, etc.,
artist placement in the exhibition. I remember in some state vinyl. So for me, it was a major figure, Metzger, or that were not so much put into light in the context like that's the moment in which I want to ask David, who I have invited also to the Biennale, who was a central actor of the Signals Gallery, and when he moved from the Philippines to America, where he has studied, and then to London, he became a major figure of the art, meeting also a lot of artists to which he gave light, like Lydia Clark, for example. And of course, he had the opportunity to meet John Latham. So as an artist, what would you say about the artist, John Latham?
Well, I'll feel the first time I met John Latham was at Oxford, and I went there to see an exhibition of artists from Amsterdam. Some of the historic books. It was very strange with the project I had about the Phoenix, who was being burned. Experience of the Second World War. And the last time I saw him was with his two sons, Jean Paul and Noah, in New York, after he had an exhibition in Philadelphia. We had a wonderful time eating, the three of us together in the Lower East Side. I think that's the beautiful thing about John Latham. In my generation, we love each other. And we cared for each other. In fact, APG was caring for people like Carlyle Reedy and Stuart Bristy and all these different artists that needed an audience. And we did that at Signals too, mainly with Latin American artists, Kinetic artists. And our gang, our composer, very strange people, like Sylvester Udar, who did abstract forms and using an old typewriter as a monk, and then making an exhibition in which he masturbated for a whole year and preserved his masturbation. And we did that show together with Antonio Sena, an artist from Portugal. And so John Latham was very strange when they moved from Holland Park, from Holland, which is very posh, the artists there were to become. It was a different world altogether, and he was able to adapt to it. And I once asked him, because he and Barbara had 3 children, Xenia, Jean Paul, and Noah, and said, "Why did you have names like this?" He said he enjoyed Jean Paul Sartre when he was young, and he called it one of his sons, Jean Paul, and he enjoyed Paul Gauguin's diary about Noa. And he called him after Paul Gauguin's diary, which is so strange, isn't it? It just shows you how eccentric all artists are, and that's what I like about the generosity and spirit. And finally, when I met Noa Latham through a lady who's here, to her side. It's Roberta Kravitz. They came around to Artists for Democracy, and then I invited Noah to come with me to Paris to experience Paris with a lot of Parisian artists, and the parents. I stayed overnight in Holland Park. Your mother, Barbara, and John Latham prepared some proper underwear and pajamas. He said, don't be too cold when you get to France. I said, well, France, they have good heating there, don't they? And it's so wonderful. This is the feeling that you have. Somehow they're never portrayed as being really just simple and human. That's what I enjoyed about this exhibition, Viva Arte Viva, because it just shows that artists are really a lot of human beings. And John Latham's friends, we were all fairly kind of scandalous. We had Gustav Metzger doing autodestructive art. And then there was once John Latham, who was at St. Martin's School of Art, where I was a kind of teacher of Oriental civilization. He went there and started to eat a book by Clement Greenberg. And in fact, I was looking for a book of Clement Greenberg's for us to eat, and couldn't find any. Next time you have a Tavola Aperta, have something like what John Latham did. So we can just imagine ourselves eating Clement Greenberg and chewing I just have a kind of poster, I think, that when we were in Paris at the Live Life thing with John and the YBAs, the Live Life was brought to Portugal, and John actually went there with my friend Adam Nankervis to Lisboa. He was very willing to be with artists who were not famous, who were also experimental, and that's what I like about that our generation. We never believed in just kind of establishment name. We were ever experimental, and you can be on. She was always experimenting, making collages. There's the problems of IRA in her home country, Ulster. Most people didn't understand when she went to Andy Warhol's factory. They couldn't understand what she was up to, but Rita Donner herself was not understood at this rate because they did not want any artists being involved with social problems. We talked about artist placement group, and I hope it still continues. And I hope it continues from here, from Venice. Viva Arte, viva.
Thank you so much. That's a great conclusion. I want to thank you to be here with us, and thank you, Noah. Thank you, Hans Ulrich. Thank you to you, David. We love you.
Thank you, Christine.